lineup of panelists, experts, that we've come to rely on over the years to give us insight on our most pressing tax issues. Of course, we've all been dominated and by COVID all these last few months, so that will obviously factor largely into what we discussed today as well. But we will try to also talk about things beyond COVID at some point here. And Without any further ado, though, as you can see, we're going to be taking a break around 2:15 for 15 minutes, and then rejoin at 2:30 for our final two panels, and end with a roundtable discussion on what your most pressing tax and revenue issues are that you're facing in your state in 2021. So we would really encourage you to remain on the rest of the call so that we can share insight and the challenges that we're all facing at the state level with respect to revenue items. So I think that Representative Mako has joined us. So Representative Mako, if you wanted to say a few words here before we get started, would love to have you do that.
Thanks so much, Erlinda. I just want to thank everybody for taking the time out and to try and continue to move this process forward. So I just thank Erlinda and her team, Jackson. I see the rest of you guys out there. Thanks for continuing to do this. We still have duties and responsibilities. We still have to continue to move things forward. So it's the old alligator. And I know my objective is to drain the swamp when it's difficult to do when you're up to your butt in alligators. So thanks everybody for fighting off the alligators, but continuing to remember that our objective is to drain the swamp. So thanks a lot, Erlinda.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And just for some housekeeping items, you can always put your questions in the chat box, and we'll address them there. Jocelyn will keep track of that and let us know. And I think we decided that we were going to actually try to answer some of these questions in real time during the panel, so that we don't leave them all for the end, in order to kind of keep the conversation flowing and keep the interaction engaging. So please go ahead and don't hesitate to put your questions in the chat box, and we'll go ahead and address them with each panel. And again, you can see the agenda here. So I'm going to give a federal sort of post-election update here, followed by our remote sellers, marketplace sellers, and marketplace facilitators panel. And we're going to have Craig Johnson from Streamlined Sales Tax Governing Board, Fred Nicely from Cost, and Diane Yetter from the Sales Tax Institute offer their insight and experience on this issue, followed by the mobile workforce taxation issues. Doug Limholm and from Cost and Helen Hecht from MTC will be giving us their analysis, insight into those issues. And of course, we're taking a break for 15 minutes, and then encourage you all to please come back as we are going to discuss how states have handled previous recessions compared to how we're handling the current pandemic. And Joe Crosby from Multi-State's going to give us his expert analysis on that. And then finally, we're going to round it out with our roundtable discussion, and again, encourage you all to remain so we can discuss and share insight on how we're all handling this at the state level. Okay, and then at 3:30, we'll be done. All right, Jocelyn. Next slide, please. I'll get started. Okay. Great. So as you all, back one. Thank you. Okay. All right. So as you all know, we have officially started our lame duck Congress. They all came back, I guess, early this week, yesterday, and Senate composition, of course, won't be decided officially until January. Because of the two runoff elections that are being handled in Georgia at this moment. Actually, they came back last week. Sorry, not this week, but last week. I'm getting my weeks confused already. So we still have some indecision regarding the Senate with respect to those, the majority in those, because of those two states, the runoffs there. The House Democrats have maintained their control, but the majority has eroded. And as you can see, the congressional leadership is expected to remain the same. Of course, that will change if the Senate does, in fact, flip over to the Democrats. So at this point, Democrats are projected to maintain control or have maintained control of the House. And the main issues basically stay the same right now. Of course, there is this huge focus on COVID-19 legislation and whether or not that will still occur. We're very focused on it and hopeful that something will happen. But of course, You know, there's still a huge gap between what the Senate wants and what the House has proposed. There's still, I believe, a $1 million, trillion dollar gap between the two, big difference. And that has definitely caused, you know, obstacles in dealing with that. The president has more or less extricated himself from that process. Secretary Treasury of the Treasury, Mnuchin, is really no longer involved in these negotiations. So again, it is up to the majority, the Senate majority, the current Senate majority, and the Democrats to come to a negotiated result there. And then, of course, we've got the appropriations outlook here. You know, we are hoping that there is going to be some movement with respect to funding our government operations. Right now, we're currently functioning under a continuing resolution that is set to expire December 11th. The strategy right now appears to be passing what we call minibus spending packages to go ahead and pass these bills in packages. The House passed most of its bills this summer, and the Senate literally just released its series of spending bills last week. And so we are, you know, again, cautiously optimistic that some agreement can be found with respect to funding government operations. I think there's definitely more optimism with respect to that happening than COVID-19 relief stimulus occurring. But again, this is all still, you know, very much up in the air, especially since some are viewing these spending agreements to be the vehicle for other last-minute policy items to be sort of thrown on there as well. And the House Ways and Means agenda does appear to be closely aligned with Biden's priorities. So that's another item to factor in as well. Okay, next, neither party has a mandate. So again, cooperation is going to be key, vital going into the 117th Congress that President-elect Biden will in fact inherit. Okay, next slide, please. So now we'll talk a little bit about the Biden transition agenda. As you've seen over the course of the last 10 days or so, President-elect Biden has publicized and issued and continues to form who his transition team is going to be. They are all comprised of federal agency alumni that have got a lot of experience and, you know, that he's trusted in the past. So, you know, he's going to basically hopefully put people in there that are, you know, have a lot of legacy knowledge to continue the transition. The first 100 days, of course, will set the stage for him, and he may rescind or freeze regulations from the previous administration. But in all likelihood, President-elect Biden is truly set to inherit a status quo Congress, and will definitely need to navigate delicate policy tightrope with Speaker Pelosi and Leader McConnell. He has been bullish on prospects of being able to clinch bipartisan deals with a GOP-controlled Congress throughout his campaign, but that remains to be seen. So his major policy priorities are the following there. As you can see, number one, of course, is a comprehensive national strategy to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. He has also expressed key interest in investing in infrastructure, in providing a middle-class tax cut, reforming healthcare by expanding the ACA, and tackling climate change. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, being that the pandemic is job number one for his coming into his power there, we've got a little bit more detail about what his COVID-19 proposals are set to look at. From what we've seen, his plan is basically a $700 billion economic recovery plan that contains a nationwide mask mandate, boosts in the national stockpile, additional support for small businesses, testing, and resources for schools, $25 billion for therapeutics and the vaccine distribution. He hopes to create a national contact tracing program, and more funds for addressing state and local budget shortfalls. And finally, has expressed an interest in establishing a new U.S. public health job corps. Next slide. And a little more focused on what we're talking about today, of course, he's been pretty, I would say, vocal about what his tax proposals are going to be going to the administration. These are the list of them right here. I'll read just a few of them, but of course we've got tax credits for new investments in domestic manufacturing. He's discussed raising the corporate tax rate to 28%. Key to his campaigning was providing tax relief to lower middle income families, including the expansion of the child tax credit, increasing tax incentives to shore up retirement plans, low income renters and first time home buyers credits, taxing capital gains and dividends at ordinary rates for those with annual incomes of more than $1 million, doubling the tax rate on profits earned by foreign subsidiaries, and finally imposing a 15% minimum tax on the book income of large companies. So he has been pretty, fairly, I would say, vocal and out there with his, with his proposals for what he sees going into with respect to taxes into his administration. Next slide. Great, and that is all I have right now for our federal update. And why don't we start our next panel then? I'd like to turn it over to our next panel. There we go. Craig Johnson, Fred Nicely, and Diane Yetter. If you'd like to take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Linda. Really appreciate the task force allowing us to give an update on the state's remote seller and marketplace facilitator laws. And challenges, I think, is the right word. It's, I think, been very challenging for state tax administrators and for businesses on exactly how the laws are working in this area. It's interesting, all but 3 states have some type of marketplace facilitator law. The only 3 states that have a statewide sales tax that don't right now are Kansas, Missouri, and Florida. And I know Kansas is working on legislation probably to adopt early next year. And I wouldn't be surprised if Missouri and Florida are doing the same. But really appreciate you allowing us to give this update. I am Fred Nicely, Senior Tax Counsel with the Council on State Taxation, otherwise known as COST, and appreciate Craig Johnson, who's the Executive Director for Streamlined Sales Tax Governing Board, joining us. He's been intertwined and working with this group on a lot of marketplace laws and a lot of other sales tax issues too. And Diane Yetter is also joining us. She's with the Sales Tax Institute. And what is really good about Diane is she can bring in the perspective of a lot of the small sellers, which I think is really important for everyone to hear from. A lot of the marketplace laws were enacted with the states putting in an economic nexus threshold right after the here we go. So, in a lot of the states, it was done fairly quickly, and we really appreciate the task force working on model legislation for the states to look at with their marketplace facilitator laws. That is really, it's much appreciated. And one of the things I know the task force discussed is that they look at this as a working model that, updates may be needed as we go through the states implementing this over time. And I think one of the things you're going to see us talk about is that there are some issues that may need to be addressed in the model legislation that's out there. But already we are seeing a lot of the states have more uniformity as a result of this task force putting together model legislation. The task force has always been closely aligned with the Streamlined Sales Tax Project, and we're really pleased that the Streamlined states right now are working on disclosed practices addressing their marketplace facilitator laws. I can say, we've had at least 5-6 meetings thus far with this work group, probably more than that. And it hasn't been an easy task because the state's laws vary so much. So it's hard to come up with simple yes and no answers. But the states and the business community working on the disclosed practices has been doing a really good job. These disclosed practices, I think, are going to be very, very helpful. They're going to assist marketplace facilitators, marketplace sellers, and they're also going to help all of you as state legislators, kind of understand, what the states are doing with the marketplace facilitator provisions, and as necessary, it's going to, I think, assist you in being able to make improvements with those laws. we'd like to make sure that this is interactive. Please feel free to ask us questions as we're going through the presentation. We look forward to answering any questions that you do have. So we have only a brief period of time, 30 minutes, so I'll go through the agenda real quickly here. We can go to here we go. We're going to talk about the streamlined disclosed practices that are being worked on, and we can't cover everything because there's not enough time, but we do want to get into remote sellers, marketplace sellers, and some of the determinations they have to make, especially looking at the thresholds. Also looking at marketplace facilitators, the collecting the tax, including other taxes and fees. And I think, states are starting to realize that, they may want more than just sales tax collected, but it's important if you're going to have other taxes and fees that you take certain things in considerations that we'll discuss. And then last, we hope we have time. We'd like to talk about non-member states. There's 23 full member states in this streamlined sales and use tax agreement. We want non-member states also to participate as much as they can in the streamlined sales tax project. So we'll talk about steps that can be done there to make it easier for all sellers to be able to comply with the state's sales tax laws. So with that, I'm going to kick it off to Craig to get us started on the first topic.
All right, thanks, Fred, and thank you, Jackson, or Linda, and state and local task force members for inviting me to participate today, and really all the support that you have shown Streamline over the years. I think the work that your organization and that state legislators have done to improve the state and local sales tax laws and requirements have really done a lot to reduce the burdens that have been imposed on remote sellers and interstate commerce. But with that being said, as Fred indicated, we're going to talk a little bit about some of these disclosed practices that we're working on. And Streamline's always working with the business community and looking for additional ways to further improve the system and reduce those burdens, while at the same time being careful to respect each one of your state's sovereignty. So when we talk about some of these issues that we're looking at, getting into the thresholds itself, Streamline's been compiling the information to help remote sellers understand each state's remote sales tax collection requirements. And the process really helps remote sellers determine where there are differences in the laws. And Wayfair decision obviously was a huge win for state and local governments. And shortly after that decision, and before any uniform recommendations have been put together, states started adopting thresholds. And these thresholds, they were, I'll say similar to what South Dakota had enacted. Unfortunately, the thresholds adopted also had some variations. Now, not necessarily in the dollar amount of the thresholds, and we're talking about variations, although there were some of those too, but more in how the threshold was computed. And some of the states adopted thresholds that were based on gross receipts. So when you're determining if you have to collect a tax, you look at the gross receipts. Other states use the term retail sales, and then still others use the term taxable sales. And if you imagine if you're a remote seller making sales into all the states, you'll need to know what the basis used for calculating the threshold is in each of the states to determine if you have that collection requirement. At the time the laws weren't enacted, most people weren't really thinking about or even aware of these slight differences. But all of us, we all know that those few words, gross, retail, taxable, those make a big difference. And when you look at them all together, you start to understand kind of the difficulties faced by remote sellers. And in addition to these dollar thresholds, states also, as you know, enacted a number of transactions threshold. And the unfortunate part is states didn't define what a transaction is. So is a transaction an invoice? Is it each line on an invoice? Is that considered a transaction? What about if I place an order and when I place that order, the retailer sends me 4 different invoices because each part is shipped from a different drop shipper? Is that one transaction or is it 4 transactions? These are the real difficulties that remote sellers are encountering and really need to better understand. And I know Diane has encountered some of those with her clients, and Fred and they've been obviously an immense help as we work through these disclosed practices. But that's just one of the issues that states have adopted and are moving forward on as far as determining what is their threshold and what do sellers need to do to meet that threshold. We can move to the next slide.
Well, and Craig, before we go there, though, just, looking at the thresholds, as you had indicated, most of the states are using a $100,000 threshold, but many of them are using gross receipts or gross sales. So that means that it's all sales, whether or not they're going to be taxable. And the difference between gross receipts and retail sales is retail sales would exclude sale for resale. And I think that's something really to look at, is that, do you want manufacturers and wholesalers that are only making sales for resale to register when they're not going to be remitting any tax? And so that's been one of the things that it'll be interesting to see how the states respond in the disclosed practices. But a lot of them really seem to focus on gross receipts rather than looking at is there potential for any tax, because sales for resale, that's not going to be picked up in the sales tax base.
And to kind of go along with that, the difference between gross and taxable for certain businesses in certain industries is significant. We've dealt with a lot of companies that sell things that are exempt from tax. So whether it's digital goods or services that are not taxable in a state, but yet the rule is a gross receipts rule, which would say those taxpayers need to be registered. But I really don't think the states want them registered. And so that's where re-looking at some of this and realizing who are you trying to compel to register? Is it really just people that are making sales that are subject to sales tax, or do you really want a bunch of companies to register even though they will not make any taxable sales at all?
And I think it's good that, Craig, you had talked about the complexity with a transactional threshold. That's not part of the model. The NCSL model only has the monetary threshold. And, we are seeing a lot of issues with the transactionals, as far as how do you calculate what is a transaction. And also, while most of the states may use 200 transactions, that can oftentimes be a very de minimis amount. Much lower than $100,000 that states are using on the monetary threshold. So we have seen some states move away from the transactional threshold, but a lot of states adopted it simply because that was part of South Dakota's model that was reviewed by the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah, and on that transaction threshold, Fred, I agree. I mean, we're starting to see states think about that more and more. And if you really think about that, when you get into the de minimis numbers, and that if you have 200 transactions and you're selling t-shirts, you might have $4,000 in gross sales. Maybe it's all taxable, maybe it's not. So it ends up with can be some very small sellers and very small amounts that the states need to take care of when they're processing the returns and expecting the sellers to follow their rules. So, okay, can we next slide, please? So another thing with respect to the threshold that people need to be thinking about is how do sales on a marketplace affect their threshold computations? Is the remote seller expected to include in their calculation the sales that they make on the marketplace? Does it make a difference if the marketplace is or is not registered in a particular state? And if a state requires a remote seller to include these items in their threshold computation, and Fred, I think you and Diane have alluded to it, they're going to need to recognize that they may be receiving and will likely need to process returns from remote sellers that have very little, if any, tax due. And I think that's a question that the states have to really be thinking about is that really what you want? Do you want a seller that's making sales almost exclusively on a marketplace, and because of that, they exceed the 200 transactions, they exceed the 100,000 in sales? The fact that they make a few sales on their own that they would be reporting, do you really want them to be registered and collecting and filing and remitting the returns? Now, I can say from a Streamlined perspective, obviously with our certified service provider program, and if sellers are using that program and they're using a CSP, it's easy for them to have the CSP take care of it, have them file the electronic return and things like that. But that's something that I think states need to be thinking about when they're figuring out what to include or what to do with the marketplace sales that take place. And then, regardless of what you do with that, once you meet that threshold, the next question that the retailers have to face is, when do I need to start collecting? And some states expect sellers, based on the surveys that we've done and the information we've compiled, they expect sellers to start collecting the tax on the next transaction. Some states give sellers time to get their systems properly programmed, and it takes some time to get their systems set up. Should they be anticipating that? Should they be required to say, okay, I think that in 60 days from now, I'm going to exceed the threshold. Therefore, I'm going to go ahead and start the programming process of getting this set up. And many states' laws, quite frankly, they don't indicate when sellers need to start collecting. They're silent. They just say if you meet or exceed the threshold, you need to collect. So I think the presumption is that sellers need to start collecting on the next transaction. And the question really is, should there be some minimum amount of time that after a seller reaches those thresholds before they actually have to start collecting and remitting your state's tax? And is this something that we should look at from a uniformity perspective, and at least at a minimum, a recommendation to give sellers some time to get their system set up? Fred, Diane, anything to add on that?
Well, the one thing I'd like to add is it's not just how long does it take the seller to get set up. We've waited in some cases 4 to 6 weeks for the state to process registration applications. And some of the states have made it very clear that sellers cannot start collecting until they receive their registration number. Is that the right approach, or should it be once we submit the registration application? So if and the pandemic, I think, is a perfect example of sellers that did not think they were going to hit any thresholds. Depending upon their industry, they had escalation of sales at such a rapid pace that even if we're doing reviews every month to see where we are, I've got sellers that we work with that didn't think they would be hitting, maybe even at all in 2020. And all of a sudden in April, they exceeded the thresholds. And so to have to get registered that quickly is not just something that the seller has to do, but the states also have to be much more responsive and timely in processing registrations. There's very few states that give you a registration number online as you submit the registration application. So something to think about, that it's both sides need to be timely in doing that.
And I would add on that too, Diane, with respect to the registrations, that's one thing. All of our Streamlined member states, if you fill out the Streamlined registration, as soon as you hit the submit button, you have an email and you've got your SST ID. You are, and all the states have agreed that at that point in time, you are registered and you can go ahead and collect. So that, at least that helps in the Streamlined states.
Right.
The non-Streamlined states, that could still be, I agree, that's a problem, potentially.
Yeah, and Craig, I think marketplace sellers really need clarity on, do they have to report the sales that they have through a marketplace facilitator or not? Some states have penalty provisions if you don't put all the required sales on a return. You'd have to back off these sales. So marketplace sellers need to know, how you exclude from the tax calculation the sales where the tax was actually collected by a marketplace facilitator. And and the timing issue, just echoing what Diane had said, is that I think it's completely impractical to require a seller immediately after they exceed a threshold, they have to start collecting the taxes. It should definitely begin at the beginning of a calendar month, and it should be a reasonable period of time, which I think we'll talk about on another slide.
Okay, I
Okay,
think
can
you
I go to
can
the next slide?
the next slide. So another issue that we're dealing with is, pre-Wayfair, the standard for determining nexus is the physical presence of a seller. But yet we've got a lot of issues coming up. We've got some states that are being very aggressive going after inventory in third-party warehouses. So in a marketplace facilitator warehouse or in other fulfillment company warehouses. And does that disqualify them from being a remote seller? And one of the things to keep in mind is in the 24 streamlined states, the 23 full member and the 1 associate, that they actually allow a de minimis amount of property. We have 50,000 in property here on the slide, but it's also 50,000 in payroll that a remote seller can have in a streamlined state and still qualify as being a CSP compensated seller. The terminology used to be a volunteer seller. And this enables them to still qualify for the benefits of having the services provided by a CSP paid for by the state. And so one of the things that we are trying to look at is, will the streamlined states also still consider them to be a remote seller? There are, differences in some cases with the tax rate that applies, the sourcing rules, and in some cases, not as much in streamlined states, but some of the other states, some flat rate types of rules that are out there. So Texas, Texas, Alabama have the flat rates. Louisiana and Alaska have their remote seller authorities. And in those states, if you have physical presence in the state, you now do not qualify for any of those simplification benefits. And then, as well as the inventory in the warehouses, what about employees? So what if I've got a employee, especially now with the pandemic, I've got an office employee that is working from home? Does that now eliminate my ability to qualify for a remote seller in that state? And so what we are asking is the distinction between a retail employee, so someone who is involved in making retail sales, versus a non-retail employee, a back office type of employee. Would that make a distinction in terms of whether there is a remote seller? And then the tax type also comes into play. So are we collecting a sales tax, which is typically applied when you have physical presence within a state, or is it a use tax that applies? We do have some states like the Illinois the marketplace leveling the playing field bill that comes into play January 1, that is switching it from a use tax, which makes it much easier for remote sellers, that now they are going to have to collect sales tax at the higher rate, plus having to know all of the local jurisdictions and collecting all of that. Their return is going to become much more complicated. Their sourcing rules, their ability and need to have information about all of the sales tax rates is going to exponentially increase come January 1. And so looking at all of these sorts of things coming into play, we're thinking that, some model legislation that would have some de minimis allowance for physical presence in a state that would still allow them to be considered a remote seller. If we go to the next slide. And so, what are some of the things that we would suggest to the legislators to look at within their states? So the first is, kind of looking at these thresholds that we've talked about. So having similar dollar amounts. Many of the states are at the 100,000. We do appreciate the larger states like Texas, New York, and California that have the 500,000 without a threshold. But really, I think where we really need to look at is a common definition. And we've got a slide in just a little bit with some examples of states that this is the distinction between the gross, the retail, and the taxable. We're sales tax professionals, and sometimes we even struggle to understand what the state means by the terminology that they're using. And so a retailer that is not a tax professional, trying to understand, how to measure those thresholds is something that is a big burden on them. And then the transactional threshold. I have a lot of clients that they are 99% marketplace selling, but they've got, enough transactions that they are either in total included as a remote seller that needs to register, and some really low dollars. I mean, I've got some people that we're looking as, Craig used the example of $4,000. I regularly have sellers in some of these where the transaction threshold is catching them, where they have between $5,000 and $10,000 of sales a year into any given state. And that just really raises the burden on those sellers. And then that's where the inclusion or exclusion of those marketplace sales in measuring the threshold, and also in terms of doing the returns. So I would go back to the states and say, all right, what if I am 100% marketplace seller and you tell me to include it in my threshold? Now I exceed the threshold. So now I have to file a return, but I'm going to have zero due. Now, some of the states are starting to come out and say, if you're 100% marketplace, you don't have to register and file. But if you make just one direct sale, now all of a sudden, if you otherwise exceed the threshold, you need to file. And then the time to start collecting that we've already talked about. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide.
Before we move off that though, Diane, just on focusing on the uniform treatment of marketplace sales, I think, this really encompasses a broad area, and sometimes it's not really clear for exemption certificate purposes, who has to maintain the exemption certificate? Is it the marketplace facilitator? Is it the marketplace seller? Is it both? I mean, having clear guidelines on that. Coupons, other types of discounts, are the marketplace facilitator entitled to the same discounts in the way a seller is entitled to it. And at least with the Streamlined states, worked on these disclosed practices, we've really gotten them to start thinking about it. I think that's really helpful. But the model, right now with the NCSL doesn't go into a lot of depth with that. And that's something that, may need to be revisited too.
All right, so Craig, I think you want to talk a little bit about that disclosed practice project.
Yeah. So if you go to the next, thank you. When marketplace laws and that started going into effect, and we recognized all the different various nuances that were going into the state's laws, we put together a chart that identified for all states, and it's all states, not just Streamlined states, but all of the member states that are, or all the states that are willing to provide the information, just general information related to the remote seller collection responsibilities, effective dates, thresholds, links to information that each state put out. We compiled all that and put it all together. Although it's pretty limited information, it certainly helped remote sellers, and having all that information in one spot was helpful to them. And then providing links to all the different states' information we found was helpful. However, as time has gone on and people started really to dig into the requirements and started looking at that, it's raised more questions than answers, I think, in many cases. And it's resulted in a lot of differences in interpretations that are happening. So what we're doing now is we're working with the business community to identify specific issues and questions that remote sellers, marketplace facilitators, what do they have related to their collection or remittance requirements, or what questions do they have that they need answers to, and identifying how the different states' laws differ. And, Diane and Fred have both been very, very helpful in that area, as well as a number of others from the business community. And, you are the folks that are dealing with this on a multi-state basis. Most states or state folks are dealing with it only on their state's basis. They look at it from their state's perspective only. So we're developing a list of disclosed practices that lays out these questions. Again, so that every state, both SST and non-SST, you can answer the questions, and it's going to be provided in a uniform format so businesses can understand what the expectations are in each of the states. The format that we put together, it's also broken down between remote seller questions, marketplace seller questions, and marketplace facilitator questions. And the marketplace facilitator questions that are in there, many of them address the issues that are contained in the NCSL model legislation and how the states, either they've adopted it or they haven't adopted it. And once that's completed, I think it's going to make it really easy for state legislators in particular to look at that listing and look at the chart and look at how the states completed it, look how your state completed it, and see how things are being handled in your state in comparison to other states, and see if there may be better ways to handle certain issues from your perspective. It might also lead, and I think likely will lead, to the development of some additional, at least, recommendations to consider, so that some of these issues can be addressed in a more uniform manner. And once we have this done, we will put the information out not only for the Streamlined states, but for the non-member states as well. If you can jump to the next slide, we just have a snippet of some of the guidelines that we've put out so far. And this is what we have on our website right now. It's available to all sellers. It's available to anybody that wants to go out there. And you can see we have the information for all states, not just Streamlined states. The disclosed practices that we're working on ultimately end up as part of our taxability matrix. I mean, that's what our goal is, but we'll be able to put that information out in a format so that all states can participate with it and sellers can see it for all states. And Diane, I know when we were talking about this slide, you thought this was a good slide for people to see all the differences that are out there.
Yeah, you can just look at an example. Vermont, the measurement is a 12-month period. If you look at West Virginia, it's preceding calendar year or current year. If you look at, Washington as an example, it's gross retail sales exceeding 100,000. I realize that should mean that it's retail sales, but gross retail makes it confusing to people that don't know otherwise. So you can see that just the terminology, and some of it is required because that's what the state calls it, but then to have a way to explain it is what would be helpful. So I think we've just got a couple minutes left, so we might want to hit on some of these other items quickly.
Yep, next slide.
Yeah, I can start this off if you want me to. I talked about this a little bit at the beginning. You know, when the states, when you were enacting your marketplace facilitator laws, the focus was on the sales tax side. But I think some of the sales tax administrators and you know, some of you as legislators started to realize that well, maybe there's other taxes and fees that should be collected by the facilitators with a transaction. And you know, the issue is there needs to be clear law that makes it, you know, very clear what the marketplace facilitator is required to collect. So 911 charges or other types of miscellaneous fees, if that responsibility is going to be put on the facilitator, it really needs to be clearly done via legislation. And, you know, time needs to be provided because not all the marketplace facilitators have systems to be able to collect all different types of miscellaneous fees that may not even be reportable to the revenue agency. It may go to another entity altogether. And you can have a different calculation mechanism, definitely has a different tax rate than the overall sales tax. So really important to be able to address those types of fees via legislation, and adequate time is really vital. And you know, there's always a concern with marketplace facilitators and what can they rely on from the marketplace sellers in the representations of what they're selling. That continues to be an issue too. And one of the questions that's in the disclosed practices is whether or not a state revenue agency has issued a policy on the reliance a marketplace facilitator can use for relying on what they have when they're selling a product to determine taxability. So that should be helpful to encourage the revenue agencies to put out policies there. The opt-out provisions that would allow a marketplace seller to continue to collect the tax. There's not a lot of uniformity there. A lot of the states have little nuances there. So having more uniformity for the marketplace facilitators and the marketplace sellers to come into agreement to have the marketplace seller still collect the tax would be helpful. You know, it could be for any type of seller, or maybe there's certain types of industries, such as the telecommunications companies or the ride share programs, where it's appropriate to make sure that there is an opt-out. And some states have focused on the size of business. Some have not. You know, that's something to take in consideration. I don't know, Diane or Craig, if you have anything else you want to add. I know we're running short on time.
Yeah, the only other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is when we start talking about these other taxes and fees, they are not always administered at the state level. And so now you have the complexity that, you know, what if there's something that is subject to the sales tax on an invoice, but also subject to an alternative tax? You know, I'm seeing that. I've got a client in the entertainment business, and they're selling tickets to things, which are often a local amusement tax, but they also can add into the same cart, you know, a t-shirt or a, you know, CD or something like that. And so now you've got a real myriad of what are we going to do? And, you know, there's a lot of confusion to the purchaser, to the customer, as to what is actually happening with their invoice. So if we want to go to the next slide to just kind of, you know, sum it up on the facilitators is, you know, we really need clear legal authority for the requirement of a facilitator to collect those other taxes. So, you know, where this marketplace collection is sitting within the sales and use tax statutes, but other things like a telecom tax or an amusement tax or a meals tax may be in a completely separate section in the statute. And so is there coordination between those? It's not always clear. And then in these alternative taxes, we really need more time to set those systems up. And then some sort of opt-out requirement. And, you know, is there a process that the state needs to follow? Also that the taxpayer needs to follow? And is there a possibility to get a coordinated effort? So some sort of multi-state opt-out form. So I don't know if we've had any questions come in that we can talk briefly if we've got another minute or two, or Linda, that we can just give Craig a second to explain what we'd love to see from the various different states. And then I haven't seen any questions in the chat. I don't know if anything has come in any other way.
I haven't seen any questions, but you've got another minute if you'd like to continue
Okay.
the train of thought. Mhm.
Okay, Craig, you want to just talk a little bit about what we're hoping to get participation wise?
Yeah, if we can jump and you can go to the next slide right away, and this deals with non-member state participation, and we recognize that it's maybe not possible for states to go all the way down the path to full membership in Streamlined. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to give states an opportunity to participate with us on some of the things that we've developed. You know, we want to make available and make it easier for these states to come in along with us, so that hopefully the remote sellers that will be collecting your tax will be able to do it in a way that really reduces their burdens. We also want them to take advantage of the experience and the knowledge that Streamline has gained over the last 15 to 20 years in this area. Jump to the next slide. What we did is we adopted a resolution that would allow non-member states to participate with Streamline if they enact certain limited requirements, certain limited simplifications. And these are really requirements that the members of the business community help put together and help identify that really significantly reduces the burden in complying in the states where they're a remote seller. I mean, obviously we'd like states to join as full members, but if they can't do it, we want to make sure that they're aware that there's an opportunity for them to participate with us as a non-member, as a non-member state, if they do just certain limited or meet certain limited requirements. And again, these are things that really will help the remote sellers in the long run. And you know, one of the things that I can't stress enough, I mean, the success of our CSP program and the certified service providers and having them take care of the sales tax collection and remittance responsibilities for the sellers, that has grown significantly since Wayfair has happened, since the Wayfair decision came out. We are seeing, and if you want to jump to the next slide, just with some of our couple of our quick successes, we now have over 12,000. We're pushing 13,000 right now, active sellers that are registered through Streamline. We are seeing 200 to 400 new sellers, a net increase of 200 to 400 sellers every month. That means we might have had 500 new registrants for the month, but there might have been 100 businesses that maybe they went out of business. Whatever the case may be, they unregistered from the system. So our net increase though is 200 to 400 a month. Since Wayfair, we've seen over a 300% increase in the net active registrations. And obviously our member states, the pandemic has not helped them with their revenues, but I will tell you that I've had a number of our member states that have made comments to me that had they not been members of Streamline, had Wayfair not been decided the way it was, they'd be in a much more difficult position from a revenue perspective, and their revenues are increasing 2 and 3 times what they were pre-Wayfair from remote sellers. So just again, making sure that people understand the way Streamline has grown, making sure that if you're a state that's not a member, make sure you understand that there is an opportunity for you to participate with us. And we would love to have you come along and again, make it easier for remote sellers and make it easier for your constituents if they're having to collect in other states as well. So with that, I know Fred, Diane, any last comments?
The only comment I would suggest is even without entering into the more formal agreements with Streamlined in their limited role, this disclosed practice document that we're putting together, we would love every state to participate and encourage your Department of Revenue to do that. It would be a consistent format. It would be the questions that the taxpayers all feel that we need to have answered. So we would encourage the legislators to kind of strongly encourage their revenue departments to participate in that and complete that. And as Craig said, Streamlined will populate and post the answers on the Streamlined website. And then obviously the state could use it as a great resource for their remote sellers, marketplace sellers, and marketplace facilitators. Fred, any closing comments?
Yeah, I just hope 2021 is the year that we can get some non-member state participation. And what's really important is it probably does require legislation for a non-member state to participate to address, the CSP compensation and some other issues. But the business community, and I know Craig with Streamline would be more than willing to work with you to work on the legislation to make that happen. That's all I have to appreciate it.
Okay, thank you all for that very enlightening panel. We appreciate your time and your efforts in presenting those topics. And we'll move right along into our next panel, remote work, mobile workforce taxation issues, with Doug Lindholm from Cost and Helen Hecht from MTC.
Great. Thank you, Erlinda. Thank you, Jackson. We very much appreciate the opportunity to speak on these issues. And the pandemic has really raised the visibility of these issues. And it's really two issues, but there's a significant overlap. And it's a fundamental question of, if you're a traveling employee, if you're working away from your office, when do you owe personal income tax to the state, and where do you owe it? And then secondly, when and where does the employer have a withholding requirement? And if you'll, Jocelyn, go to the next slide, this is kind of an overview of the two issues that we're going to talk about. The first is temporary, that is traveling non-resident employees. And those are people that travel for work. And this is an issue that we've been addressing or trying to get a resolution in Congress for over a decade. And we are, as a result of our inability to shifting to more of a state-by-state approach. The second one is the question of remote teleworkers. That is, if you are now working outside of your office location where you weren't before as a result of the pandemic, then you're a teleworker. And those periods are typically longer, but I can recall when in March or so, when the pandemic first hit, there was a sense that, well, maybe folks can come back into the office in a month or two, right? So that looked like temporary. It's not. It's now more of a permanent basis. Helen, any comments before we go into some of the details on this?
Thanks, Doug. I'd also like to thank the task force and Linda for inviting the Multi-State Tax Commission to speak today. I guess I would say these are related issues, but I think there are some differences between them, and I think we can talk more about those differences. The traveling employees issue is something, we've recognized as states for a number of years is an issue, but teleworker employees, I think, raises some different issues. So hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about those.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's a slight overlap only if you're a teleworker for less than a small point. So let's start with the first one, the temporary traveling non-resident employee. That is, and in nearly half the states right now, if you're a non-resident employee, that is, you leave your office to do work in another state, you incur a liability. That is, you owe personal income tax and you have to file a personal income tax return to that state as of the first day in the state. And typically, if that liability attaches, the employers incur a related withholding obligation. There are some states like New York when those two are disconnected, but for the most part, they are connected. And this is not a requirement that applies just to corporate entities. It applies to all employers, public and private, nonprofits, unions, state and local governments, even the federal government. And the difficulty here is, and let's take me as an example. I travel, well, prior to the pandemic, I would travel to 20 to 25 states a year. And I would admit it, I do not comply with those states' laws because it would typically be a small dollar return that I would file in that state and then have to take a credit against I'm in Virginia, my Virginia return. And if everybody fully complied with the laws on the books today, it would very quickly overwhelm every state Department of Revenue's capacity to process those returns. It would be a huge time and compliance suck and just not worth it. So we're trying to find a reasonable solution that balances the compliance burdens with the need to make sure that the states have a reasonable revenue source, right? We don't want to provide a free lunch for anybody. And one other point about how difficult compliance and enforcement here is, and we'll get to this in a little bit when Helen talks about their proposal, a lot of states that have a little bit more than liability on the first day you're in the state, they impose a dollar threshold. They say you don't have to comply until you pass a certain dollar threshold. Well, that makes compliance infinitely more difficult because in most cases, or in numerous cases, an employee doesn't know what their full compensation is going to be until the end of the year. They may get paid with a bonus. It could be a substantial part of their salary. They could be working on commission. Their commission could come in the next year, or a commission from a prior year from a different state could come in. So very, very impossible, very difficult, nearly impossible to determine how much you've actually earned in a state. So what we've done is over the past decade, I'm going to move through these very quickly. If you go to the next slide, we have proposed what we call the Mobile Workforce Bill before Congress. And we've been working on it for over a decade. The language hasn't changed significantly. There's one added exclusion in this 10-year period. And the remarkable thing about this bill is its bipartisan support. If you look, we got the bill through the House, 3 separate Congresses, and the 112th, the 113th, and the 114th and the 115th. And it was typically passed in the House on the consent calendar by voice vote. That means nobody objects to this. It's a good government bill. It has a reasonable approach, a good balance in our sense. And even this last Congress, we got 62 Senate sponsors. Now, those of you that are well-versed in cloture, you realize that 60 votes invoke cloture, and that should be enough to get it through. Well, in the Senate, one state can object, and we've had objections from New York because New York feels like New York aggressively audits this issue and feels like it would impact their revenues. The 116th Congress, the second tranche of stimulus, the HEALS Act, had a provision in there that would have included our legislation, the 30-day threshold, and would have added some provisions that would provide relief for teleworkers as well. And we'll get into that. I want to walk through this very quickly just to show you the basic structure of how the federal bill would work. And we're taking the federal bill, and that's the bill that we will use to go to states to try and get the states to adopt this. The reason we've been going to Congress is that, I realize the states have a knee-jerk reaction opposed to federal preemption. But if there's one time when federal preemption is entirely appropriate, it's when tax actions cross state borders. And here, if you're a state and you're trying to protect your workers, your residents from being taxed by other states, you cannot do that unless the other state has an exactly similar law and a reciprocity provision. It's easier to get it done through federal legislation. Unfortunately, it hasn't been, so we're focusing on getting uniform laws at the state level. So let's go to the next slide. I want to point out who is supporting this on the proponents side. AICPA is a huge supporter, and AICPA is about as nonpartisan a group as you can get. Their sole concern is with compliance and ease of compliance and making sure that they can file returns. AICPAs and the state CPA associations are put in a particularly difficult situation because they have to ask their clients, where did you travel this year? Did you travel anywhere other than the state where your office is? And if they're told, they say, well, we have to file those returns, even though you were only there for a day. The law says that if you're there for a day, you have to file a return. Even though the state doesn't want it, the employee doesn't want it, that's the law. The AICPA preparer is bound to comply. The American Payroll Association, same issues, very, very tough for compliance here. There's also some 300 plus entities that are in our coalition that we're working on this. So essentially what the legislation would say is state cannot impose personal income tax on wages, employee wages, unless it's in the employee state of residence or a state where the employee is present performing duties for more than 30 days. Now, up to those 30 days, the employer continues to withhold on that employees' wages in their state of residence. So they're still paying tax. There's no free lunch for that 30 days. Now, let's go to the next slide, if you would. So, and again, the MTC, the chairman of the MTC, Julie McGee, years ago testified as to on our bill and objected to the fact that they thought it was essentially voluntary, and it's not voluntary. All this bill says is that that there will be no penalties applied. Doesn't mean that the withholding doesn't apply, but it gives a sort of a framework for how employers can determine when an employee is traveling to another state. And we allow the employer to rely on the employee's annual determination of time. That is, if the employee knows that they have a job where they'll likely be in a state for more than 30 days, then they'll tell the employer, I plan to work here, here, and here. You're going to have to withhold when I let you know. We liken it to getting an employee to fill out a W-4 every January that says, how much do you want for withholding? You can do it during that same process. You can file a W-4 and say, also, my job, I'm going to be setting up a hotel in this state for 3 days. You need to reply. You need to withhold when I do that. The difficulty of going below 30 days is that you increase the likelihood of employees and employers backing into a withholding obligation and a liability near the end of the year unknowingly. And then it's very difficult to do backup withholding near the end of the year. So, and again, if the employer has a time and attendance system in place, they have to use data from that system. But if they don't, and they don't, the employee doesn't tell them, it doesn't mean that the withholding is still not due, it's still not liable. It just means that the employer will not be held liable for penalties for failure to withhold. Let's go to the next one. I'm going to move through some of these definitions. Probably the biggest the issue that we confronted is who to exclude. And we've excluded professional athletes, entertainments, certain public figures that are paid in their professional capacity. And these are folks who come into a state for a specific event. They're paid for a football game or they're paid for a concert. Those are excluded. Those, so many states have funding mechanisms, have bonds backed by, visiting team salaries, that it's best to exclude those. And so anybody paid on a per event basis would not fit in those in this bill. The other exclusion is qualified production employee. If you're working for a film group and your state has a film tax credit program, in many cases, those tax credit programs are paid by the withholding on the employees that come in. So if you're a qualified production employee, as it's defined in the bill, then those are also excluded. And I suspect that could be, that provision could be added or excluded on a state-by-state basis, depending on whether your state offered a film tax credit or not. Let's move on. And again, time and attendance system, a lot of employees do apply these. Law firms, accounting firms that have timesheets that track an employee's location and work, those would be in full compliance. But there are a lot of companies, the vast majority, that do not make their employees to fill out timesheets or to file have a time and attendance systems. Those are the companies that would be able to rely from a penalty standpoint on where their employees specify they need to be withheld from. And again, this is not the company's money. This is money that is being paid to employees. All right, let's go to the next one. And Helen, I know that you and I have had numerous conversations about these. I know the MTC has several issues. So this is the MTC in 2011 had their own resolution, and this is where it came out. So it's all yours.
Thank you, Doug. Let me just respond to a couple things, and I want to keep us all on track, so I'm going to do this relatively quickly. I think Doug hit on two issues that have kept us apart So I can focus on some of the differences between the federal legislation and the model that the Multi-State Taxation Commission came up with. But let me just say, first of all, we recognize that especially the issue of traveling employees is an issue. States typically don't go after those kinds of, that kind of presence in the state. They don't typically try and enforce the withholding in that situation. So it hasn't been something that businesses have necessarily fallen afoul of, but we recognize that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that if you're just traveling for a few days or even a couple weeks, that you would then have to, and the business has no other presence here, that you would then have to file, and the employee would have to pay tax in that state. That seems a little silly. Now, of course, not every state has a personal income tax. There are about 10, 11 states that don't tax wages. So you may be coming from a state which doesn't tax your wages, and even then, we think that it doesn't make sense for the state in which you're in on such a limited basis to try and tax those wages or try and make the employer withhold. Doug mentioned the dollar amount. This has been a big sticking point, and when we've done our presentations in the past, I'm glad that Doug mentioned the fact that it's the enforceability of this that's really the problem. Because I think there are ways to get around that. I think there are ways to address that. And so for states who say, you know what, if you can exclude certain employees, you can exclude certain kinds of workers, then why not exclude some high-paid workers, even if you can't tell exactly how much you're going to make this year? Maybe there's a way to have that kind of dollar amount threshold applicable, because I think that's been a big sticking point. The other thing, of course, is the fact that we oppose federal legislation, not just because it's federal legislation and imposes on state sovereignty, and that's enough, but because it's often very difficult to administer, and it's up to the courts in almost every case when there's a dispute to resolve that dispute, and that becomes expensive not only for tax administrators in states, but for taxpayers. So I'm glad to hear that the cost is considering getting this kind of legislation enacted at the state level, because I think that works better. And I'll just give you an example. When we were getting ready for this, I said to Doug, I think that your 30-day standard applies only to working days. And he said, no, I think it applies to all the time that's in the state. And when you read the language in the bill, it's not entirely clear. So it's those kinds of things that come up in the context of federal legislation that end up going to the courts and drag out years and years and don't get very well resolved and take a lot of time and effort to get resolved. So I think maybe we're making some steps in the right direction. I would say there are a couple other things that our bill does that are, I don't know, in some ways, I guess, significantly different than the federal legislation. We have a definition of related person or related party, so we don't want gaming the rules. If all you have to do to get around the rule about how long this person has been in the state or that sort of thing, then we don't want that happening. That's not going to come up very often. I don't think that should be a big issue, but any kind of anti-abuse rule, I'm a tax administrator, and our job is just made that much harder if the scofflaws, have a back door that they can, and everybody else is trying to comply with the law. We would rather it just be an even level playing field for everyone. So any kind of anti-abuse rules, that's the other reason why I think state legislation is often better, because if you find out that there are abusive practices, it's a whole lot easier to go in and fix those in state legislation than it is in federal legislation. So let's see, is there anything else on this slide? Why don't we go to the next slide?
Can I make two comments, Helen?
Can I stop you? No, go ahead.
So the comment on the dollar threshold, when it is very hard to comply, but it's a non-starter for us, not just because it's difficult to comply. And in her bill, it says anybody who's over $130,000 is excluded. and construction services is in there. And I think both of those were at the request of only 1 or 2 states. And, you know, that's
I have some of those. No, it's good.
seeking uniformity at the federal level. But the problem is, if you have a dollar level, that the company, instead of just tracking those employees that are traveling for more than 30 days, all of a sudden they have to track everybody. And it compounds the current requirement. It actually makes it worse than the current requirement.
Well, but Doug, I assume that they know what they paid their employees in past years. And so what I would envision, and we didn't do this in our bill. I mean, this is a great conversation because it really is administrative difficulty that's the problem. You've had this employee, if you have, I mean, it's kind of like estimated payments. If this is your first year, you get a get out of jail free card. If that employee's been on the books for 3 or 4 years and they're making over a certain amount of dollars in those past years, they're exempt, they're excluded. And I think $130,000 is just sort of, that's a place marker. You know, it doesn't have to be that low, it could be higher. But I mean, one of the reasons why we've excluded some of these employees is because they get paid a lot of money for a very limited amount of time. And so it's not about the state giving up just a small, tiny bit of money. It's about a larger amount of money. So that's the concern.
So the other thing that folks have to remember is that this is a two-way street, right? So let's talk about, and New York is the state that is taxing people who come into their state. They're the state that aggressively enforces it. But New York residents who make a lot of money and travel to other states are not being taxed. So there's a mismatch. If everybody complies, then there would be a wash. New York would not get the money from out-of-state residents because they would perhaps want to protect their own residents from being taxed in other states. So, you know, this is a great conversation to have, Helen. I think that we need to get, let's get some sort of law on the books that eliminates, and, you know, you said earlier that administrators typically don't go after this kind of thing. Well, that's great that you guys can ignore the law. The folks that are subject to the law cannot do that. And the AICPAs that see the law on the books can't say, oh, well, Helen says that we don't go after that, right? That's the fundamental difference.
So I would say, having practiced in the tax area for a number of years, we overlook little things all the time. But if we didn't, the system wouldn't work very well. But let me just make one other point, because I do think there's room to talk about this issue of dollar threshold. But you made one other point about the, and this is on the next slide. You made one other point about the time and attendance. The last time I looked at the bill, the time and attendance system was voluntary. So if the employer wants to use a time and attendance system to track where the employee actually is during the year, they can, but they're not required to. And in every case,
you're partially right. If the employer has a time and attendance system that tracks specifically what states they're in, then the employer has to use it. That's not.
I mean, if that's the case, I think that's important, because obviously if you're reimbursing travel costs, you need to have a time and attendance system. You need to have some kind of travel tracking system. So I don't know if we're talking the same thing. But since employers who reimburse the travel costs of their employees need to have the ability to show the IRS in the states, this is just a reimbursement. This isn't taxable wages. I think a lot of employees could maybe meet that. And here's the problem that we have with this idea of you're estimating at the beginning of the year. I travel a lot, you travel a lot. I couldn't know necessarily where I'm going to be at the beginning of the year for the next year. So in December, where I'm going to be next November, for example. So we see that as being a big giant loophole that you could drive a truck through.
Well,
and I understand what you're trying to do. You're trying to
So here, like you, I travel a lot. Now, I don't know where I'm going to be in November, but it's unlikely that I will be there for more than 30 days. So, and in no state that I traveled last year, which 25, I was there for maybe 3 or 4 days, right?
Right,
And
but the standard is not what you did last year. The standard is fraud.
no,
So fraud is a pretty high standard. If you say, well, I don't think I'm going to be, even though I might be, and chances are pretty good that I would be, that's not fraud. So I think that's, from an administrator standpoint, when we see that, we say, man, we could never enforce that.
I know,
It's
but
just gonna
again,
be voluntary.
but on audit, Helen, the withholding is still due, okay? All it does is protect the employer from a penalty for late withholding, okay? So if somebody does work more than 30 days, they didn't tell their employer, and that's caught on audit, then yes, they don't, the company doesn't get away with it, nor does the employee, but the employer doesn't get penalized because its employee didn't tell them.
So just, and this, and we're right at the end. So I just want to clarify that what you're saying, Doug, is if at the end of the year, it turns out I was in the state more than 30 days, even though I estimated that I wasn't, the employer then has a withholding obligation, but wouldn't owe penalties and interest.
That's correct.
Okay, so it wouldn't be based on audit. It would just be,
Well,
I
right.
see that you were there more than 30 days.
Yeah.
I now have to go pay the
Yeah,
withholding.
I have to correct that. And see what that does is, and this is why if you go down to 20 days, you increase the likelihood that people are going to back into it at the end of the month. If you have 30 days or more, and we initially wanted 60 days because it was a wash, then those people that have that type of job that they know they're going to be traveling to one state for more than 30 days typically plan those.
So this is good, because I had a thought as we were coming into this presentation that what this is really all about from your standpoint, and what you've always said, is it's administrative ease. This doesn't have to be right. The withholding doesn't have to be right for the employer or the employee until the end of January of the following year. If there was a way to true up, if there was a way to take the money out of the state where we actually paid it and put it in the state where we should have paid it, I think that's an important part of this, that to the extent that states say, well, we're going to let you true up. You tell us you paid the tax in the wrong state, we'll give it back to you. You can go pay it to the right state. And that would also, I think, go a long way. No penalties, no interest, to getting it right by the time it has to be right.
Right. No, and I think that was our goal. Again, if there is a time and attendance system that was designed for that purpose, the company has to use it. If not, then they can rely on what the company has told them for purposes of whether a state can levy a penalty on the fact that their withholding was incorrect.
Is this going to be part of your legislative agenda in the states in the coming year?
It is, yes. And actually, Illinois has already adopted this 30-day rule. So very happy. Let's spend one more minute on the teleworker, because we could spend another half hour on that issue. And I just want to talk about 2 issues here that are creating havoc among employers. And that's the question of nexus. If a teleworker is working in a state where you do not have nexus, does that create nexus? Courts have said yes. Fortunately, most states have said, look, we're not going to go after nexus if during the temporary pandemic lockdown, right? Which is, it's great that there's a recognition of that. Begs the question, what happens after the pandemic's over? The second one is, where does the employer withhold for the employee at their work location, which is where they would be absent the pandemic, or their location of telework, which in many cases, the employer has no idea where that employee is. Are they at their home? Are they at their vacation house? Are they at their parents' house in Texas, right? So we have asked states to, at least during the pandemic, and this is also in the second stimulus tranche that has not passed, to say, look, you've got to give companies the option of either withholding where their employees used to work at their office location or at the location of telework, because there are some companies that have a system in place that automatically tracks where that employee is and withholds accordingly. And you don't want to make those companies change their systems during a temporary, upset over the pandemic, right? So those are the big issues. But we have huge issues with respect to teleworking, because I did a count. I found a chart. About 8 states say that you have to withhold in the location of the employee's state, where they are teleworking from. And about 15 states have said you have to continue withholding where your employee was working prior to the pandemic. Now, obviously, if you're one of those states where they're withholding the pandemic and you're in a state, you're teleworking in a state that says you got to withhold here, terrific problems about double tax, about filing double returns and trying to get credits. And I'm not even going to begin to talk about the convenience of the employer rule, which has got New Hampshire so up in arms about Massachusetts' assertion of the convenience of the employer rule that they're suing New Hampshire, or New Hampshire suing Massachusetts for taxing their former residents when they're working in New Hampshire, which imposes no income tax. So this is an issue that is crying out for some relief. And at the very least, during this pandemic, we would hope that administrators would be a little bit reasonable about the conundrums that many employers are facing about where to pay and where to withhold. Any comments? I know we're short on time, but Helen, any comments on this issue?
No, I would just say that it's interesting. The Massachusetts position is temporary. Basically, you're in New Hampshire because you're working remotely because of the pandemic, and we're going to continue to withhold on you here. I'm not sure I see the distinction between status quo and what Massachusetts is saying. But.
So what happens after? That's the other thing, is that with the pandemic, a lot of companies have decided that they can telework constantly. Then what happens afterwards?
So your bill would address teleworking more?
No,
your idea would address.
Our bill doesn't, and
Okay.
It's an issue that we're not sure if we have an issue. There are provisions in the stimulus
Federal.
that hasn't passed that would address this, but unfortunately only on a temporary basis. And the real issue is, I think the bill goes through the end of 2020. Obviously, if the pandemic is extended, it would have to be extended. And the real issue is what happens after. We're in a new normal now with a lot of companies have gone to a complete telework model, and they don't know where those folks are teleworking from. So, some folks.
So it sounds like you're advocating for a convenience rule.
No. I'm just saying that there needs to be some thought put into this because it cuts both ways. The convenience rule, it seems very unfair if you are continuing to tax a worker who's doing work in a state that they're not receiving any benefits from. So quite the opposite.
I think we're done, Arlinda, unless there are any questions.
Okay, there we are. Questions. Okay.
So do we have any questions? Let me see if there's any.
I don't see any in the chat.
No questions. This is an ongoing issue, and it's right in the it's of utmost concern to a lot of companies right now because teleworkers are saying, I'm working in Pennsylvania. Why are you withholding in New York? Or why are you withholding in New Jersey? Right? The other complication here is that a number of states have reciprocal agreements where they agree not to withhold on employees going across state lines. So what I'd love to see is a 50-state reciprocal agreement, right? But we're not there yet. Thank you, Arlinda. Very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, friends. I appreciate that. Very spirited discussion about the remote workforce issue, which I know we're all handling right now. We're all dealing with it. So actually, let's shorten our break by a few minutes here so we can stay on track. Let's maybe regroup at, well, let's see, it's 14:26. Why don't we regroup at, let's say, 2:30. Well, 2:30, 2:32, something like that. We'll regroup. Okay, friends. Well, we'll cut it. We won't take a long break this time. So 2:30-ish, 2:32. We'll restart the penultimate panel. Okay. All right. Okay, we'll just give it another minute and we'll move into our next panel, or actually it's not a panel, it's a single individual. Joe.
Just tested her, Linda. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Great, perfect.
Holy cow, Joe. You've been hanging out in your basement too damn long. What the heck?
I had to dress up for my son's 21st birthday for Halloween as the Gorton's fisherman a couple weeks ago. So I've just kept it going.
Linda says we're going to hear from Joe. So I'm looking around and going, I don't see Joe. I'm going, holy crap, that's Joe.
I'm getting ready to move up to Madison and apply for a job at the university.
You could be a professor. You just need patches on your elbows. You're good to go. A lot of stuff here, Linda.
That's right.
A lot of content.
Okay, well, I guess we can, why don't we get started then, so we don't fall too much off our schedule here. All right, Joe, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Linda. Thank you, Representative Mako. Happy to be with everybody virtually here to talk about what states have been doing in response to the pandemic-induced recession and how that compares to prior recessions. For those who don't know me, I've had the good fortune of working with this task force now since its inception nearly 20 years ago, and glad that we're continuing on in a different way. Jocelyn, you can go ahead and advance the slide. Great, thanks. So the main point of this slide is simply to emphasize what we already know, which is the current recession is not remotely resemble any prior recession. And there's a bunch of reasons for this. First, this recession wasn't caused by any underlying economic conditions, but rather by government response to the pandemic. And I don't mean that in any pejorative way, just simply factually, as governments have had to address the ongoing health crisis that has resulted in some significant economic effects, as we all know. Second, although all recessions have some sort of geographic variability, this one is much different. It's essentially a rolling recession affecting different regions at different times. And now, apparently most challenges are in the upper Midwest, although we don't know what next week, let alone next month, is going to bring. And then finally, not only do we know why the recession started, we also know exactly how it will end. The question is, when will we get there and how do we get there? Again, because it is induced by government action, obviously the longer things go, the greater the underlying economic dislocations, especially for certain industries like hospitality and travel. But for the most part, we actually know how it will end. We just don't know how to get there right now, apparently. As a result of the difference between this recession and past recessions, we've seen widely varying estimates for the impact on state revenues. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which does great work early on in May, estimated that fiscal year 2021 would see about a 40% drop in state revenues, or a 40% budget gap. And then in August updated that to about 20%, and subsequently hasn't done any further updates, but Moody's in September introduced an estimate that put it at about 11% revenue deficit for fiscal year 2021. I think that really just highlights how challenging this recession has been. What's the takeaway from that? Well, the trend is positive, but from historically bad numbers, we've obviously never seen a year when state revenues drop 40%, and even 11% would be nearly an historic high for most states. The other thing too that's different about this, and it goes back to what I said earlier about variability, is the effect on individual states. Kansas just put out some new revenue numbers last week, suggesting that they're going to see fiscal year 2021 revenue that is 11.7% higher than fiscal year 20. So although there was a small depression for Kansas in fiscal year 20, a small reduction in revenue, that fiscal year 2021 is actually now trending above average in every time they're measuring it. California, on the other hand, although again doing better than initially anticipated, is now projecting that revenues will be 2.3% lower in fiscal year 2021 than they were in fiscal year 20. Another thing that is complicating factors is that much of the current state revenue strength has been driven by federal relief to individuals and businesses. As that relief is withdrawn or diminishes, we can expect a concomitant increase, or effect on state revenues. Jocelyn, next slide, please. I don't have much to say here other than to provide some data to something that state legislators and legislative leaders already know, which is for the most part, when you encounter a fiscal downturn, taxes are not, in fact, the primary way that shortfall is addressed. Again, from CBPP, looking at the Great Recession, they estimated that 45% of all actions to balance budgets during the Great Recession came from spending cuts, another quarter almost from federal stimulus, and 15% from rainy day funds and others, and then about 16% from tax increases. So on average, about $1 out of every $7 to fix the shortfall in the Great Recession came from new taxes. And we're seeing similar actions thus far, and I'll get into that a little bit more. States did come into this recession with healthy rainy day funds, although they have been for the most part depleted. There has been substantial federal relief, not only direct state and local, but also to the economy itself, although again, that is at present drying up. And I know Linda addressed earlier on what things, what we see happening right now, still a lot of uncertainty there. And then state tax actions are actually highly unusual in the first year, which leads me into my next slide, a study that two of my colleagues, Ryan Manis and Morgan Scarborough, did looking at the dot-com bust of 2001 and the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. And fortunately, we have great data from NCSL on state tax actions going back 15 or more years. And so they were able to go through those and catalog the changes that states made. And we looked only at 5 states because 50, frankly, was too many. These 5 states have represented good geographic diversity, political diversity, and also economic diversity. And so thought were a good representative sample, especially as they're among the more populous states. In neither of the 2 earlier recessions did states move to enact significant tax increases in the year of the recession. In fact, in 2001, overall, states cut taxes on a net basis. And there's a variety of reasons for that, not the least of which is the timing of the recession. In both cases, 2001 and then 2007, we didn't really know we were in recession until later on in the year. And in fact, in the 2007 to 2009 recession, we weren't really clear that we were in a recession until 2008. It looked early on like it might be limited to parts of the financial sector, when in fact, obviously, we know we had a significant housing recession across the board. The bulk of all tax increases that were adopted came in years 2 and 3 following the recession. And interestingly, and I think probably not surprisingly, there was great variability among these states. And I'm just going to look at a couple numbers here. Following the Great Recession, California and New York increased taxes by a combined $21 billion. While Florida, Pennsylvania, and Texas, which are about equivalent from a population perspective, increased taxes by a combined $2.6 billion. So the increases in New York and California were about 8 times higher than the other 3 states when you have fairly similar populations between those 2 groups. Of the 80 some odd discrete tax increases that were enacted by these 5 states during the 2 recessions, I think this is a really interesting point that sort of confounded me at first. Only 4 of those were rate increases on broad-based taxes. So I would have thought the rational response when you need revenue, look at one of the broad-based taxes, the personal income tax, sales tax, and increase the rate in amount that's equivalent to the revenue hole you need to fill. That in fact didn't happen. And upon further reflection, it makes perfect sense why it didn't happen. And that's because legislators need to get reelected first. And second, they're looking to solve a problem, not to use a recession as an excuse to change tax systems. And so mostly what happened is legislators did targeted increases in parts of the economy that they thought could bear the increases during that particular recession, and only to the extent that they needed those tax increases to fill a current budget hole. And if we go forward, especially after the Great Recession, in 2010, there was a significant shift in state legislatures to greater Republican control. And in that 2011, 12, 13 timeframe, there were actually a fairly significant amount of tax cuts. My colleague and former NCSL staffer Neil Austin's done the math, and I can't remember what it is, but it was a lot of money. I think close to $200 billion in total tax cuts that were enacted over that period of time. The last thing about this slide, when you look at these states, it might be easy to assign some partisan flavor to it, saying like, aha, of course, California and New York had the bigger tax increases. They tend to be more Democratic states. Although that's true at a very high level, when you look at these 2 time periods, it's important to remember in California, Governor Schwarzenegger, Republican, was the governor during the Great Recession. And in New York, it was Governor Pataki and a Republican Senate. for the dot-com bust, and then a Republican Senate again for the Great Recession. And Pennsylvania had a Democratic, which did not increase taxes as much, had a Democratic governor, Governor Ed Rendell, during the recession. So although certainly partisan differences play a role, it is more, I think, a reflection of the underlying electorate, as well as the actual economic conditions that were evident in those states. Next slide, please, Jocelyn. So what have states done so far? They've acted entirely consistently with what we would expect, given what we've seen from past recessions. As some of the other speakers have talked about, Doug and Helen just talked about mobile workforce. Earlier, Fred and Craig were talking, and Diane talking about marketplace fairness. So states have looked at administrative actions to extend filing deadlines, modifying nexus requirements. Not every state, but several states, many states, in fact, have done this. New York being one of the primary exceptions, which Doug and Helen talked about as part of this overall mobile workforce effort. There's been some tax reductions in some states, conforming to the CARES Act in certain circumstances, which results in some business tax relief predominantly, and then a few tax increase actions. So California is probably first out of the box, doing something that California always does when revenue hits the skids, which is they suspend the net operating loss deduction for businesses. And when I say always, I'd have to go back and check, but it seems to me it's been at least 4 or 5 times that that's happened in my career. So not surprising there. Although that is a temporary timing difference, and I'm going to get back to that later. Although certainly businesses don't like to see tax increases when the business community itself is in difficult conditions because of a recession. Temporary changes are preferable to permanent changes. The only real tax increase I can point to that's happened thus far is in New Jersey, which extended and increased some tax rates on higher individual incomes and also on businesses. There's a host of other changes that New Jersey adopted. And this may not be surprising when we remember that New Jersey's election cycle is different than most states. They are having an election next year. So if you're a legislator in New Jersey, you definitely want to take action in the off year rather than in the election year. So that's probably part of what we saw happen there. Next slide, please. So this is where my friends in the business community start to get a little bit nervous when I start to talk about what states should be doing as they're responding to the challenges they're facing on the revenue side right now. Next slide, please, Jocelyn. So a few things that have nothing to do with raising taxes, but I think are critical for legislators. The first thing is some sort of joint legislative executive branch sharing. Now, in some of the larger states, legislatures have a full complement of fiscal staff who can do independent analyses. But for most states, that's not the case. You have competent staff, great staff in most cases, but they don't have the same amount of data that the executive branch agencies have. And so when you're in an environment that is as fluid as this one is with regard to underlying economic activity, I think it's critical that the legislature get regular updates from the executive branch and get to provide some input from their own experts monthly, at least, and not just about tax revenue, certainly about tax revenue, but about different sectoral information about what's happening in the underlying economy. Because as legislators are trying to budget and plan, especially as we head into January, you're going to need more data and more timely data than in an average year where you're really just looking about, well, is the increase going to be at the rate of inflation? Is it going to be a little bit more? Is it going to be a little bit less? Obviously, we're in a very different environment. I also recommend that legislators, legislative leaderships liaison with key employers in the state. It's important not only to get official government data, but to get more granular data from business leaders about what they're doing. Are they bringing employees back to their offices or places of businesses? Are they investing in capital expenditures? An increasing CapEx would have some positive suggestions with regard to where those business leaders thought the economy was going to be going in the future. So I do think that's important. I recognize that can be challenging at sometimes, just in terms of how do you assemble something like that. But I would encourage you as legislative leaders yourself to look at opportunities to liaison with business leaders so that you get some more granular information about what's happening in your economies. Focus on the big picture for sure. It's easy to get down in the weeds on some of these things, but right now it is the larger, higher level trends which I think are most important. And then as I talked a little bit before, that temporary problems really demand temporary solutions. It is not the time right now, I don't think, to look at wholesale changes in your tax structure, because we don't really know what's happening with the restructuring of the underlying economy, and trying to restructure your tax system right now only injects further uncertainty into a system. And then the final point, be patient, and then reflecting on New Jersey, but be decisive. I do think it makes sense to wait until you're coming into session in January. You've got 6 months worth of data on how revenues perform before you go too far down the path of formulating revenue responses. I know in some states that can be a challenge. States like Virginia, which really only meet during January and February. Georgia, you're out, if I remember correctly, at the very first week of April, and a number of other short session states have that same challenge. But I do think, it does make sense to wait as long as possible. But once you've decided that you need to make some sort of revenue change, I think it's important to be decisive. That makes the politics obviously a little bit easier, but I also think, in January, we're going to be 6 months through this fiscal year. If it becomes clear that you're going to need revenue increases to balance your budgets for the current fiscal year, you're going to want to move as quickly as possible so that you give taxpayers the notice that they need, and you can actually collect some of that revenue to help accomplish the budget goals for fiscal year 2021. Next slide, please. Jocelyn, can I get the next slide? Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. Looks like we've got a little bobble there, but I can still see it. I'll give you a second here and see if we can get to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so a couple of recommendations. I'm going to close with things that I think you should do. And then I'm going to follow with things that I think you probably shouldn't do. And then happy to take questions. I see there's one in the chat right now, I think. Nope, it's not a question. I'll try to keep an eye on that. So first thing is the inclination when governments are having budget trouble is to do across the board cuts. And I understand that need, but I think it's exactly the wrong time to think about cutting your departments of revenue. And I say that for two reasons. First of all, obviously you as legislators need all the help you can get from the executive branch in collecting legally due and payable taxes. But the other aspect of it too is that when we have such economic dislocation as we've seen over the past 7 or 8 months now, if citizens don't perceive that the tax system is fair and being fairly applied, you run the risk of expansion of the gray market and more underground activity. As everyone's trying to get by and trying to save money, it's a somewhat natural activity for many people to try to avoid additional unnecessary expenses when they're having challenges putting food on the table. And I'm sympathetic to that, but I think that you need to make sure that your revenue department has the resources they need to be able to keep the system functioning properly. The second thing is you should get technical. You should look at aspects of your tax system that could provide additional information to the Department of Revenue or to make it easier for taxpayers to comply. So one of them, for example, is information reporting. There is a lot of information that the IRS requires. It's not always the case that states require that same information be reported to state tax agencies. There's also some things at the federal level which don't frankly make sense, but because how slowly Congress moves, we haven't seen resolutions. So one example is the 1099-K form, which is one of the various information reports that taxpayers provide to the Internal Revenue Service. For much of the gig economy, those forms are not provided unless the taxpayer is engaged with the contractor for more than 200 separate transactions in a year that total more than $20,000. Those are very high thresholds for some of these things. And so you've got a situation then where taxpayers may not know that they have obligations either for income taxes or for other taxes at the state level, and state agencies aren't getting that information. Massachusetts and Vermont have both addressed this issue, and other states should consider doing so. The other thing is to work with certified service providers to facilitate sales tax collection, especially for smaller vendors. As Diane and Fred went through earlier, this is something that we know that the NCSL has been a leader in, and that the streamlined states have already addressed. But there's a lot of states that are on the phone here today that are not streamlined states. And there are still things that you can do, as Craig talked about, and as Fred talked about, and Diane talked about, that go short of fully adopting the streamlined model, but still make advances for taxpayers. And one of those is to certify service providers so that they can assist especially smaller out-of-state vendors, but really vendors across the board in complying with their sales tax regimes. And then, if all else fails, you should consider tax increases, but I think you should do that with in a temporary fashion, as I've indicated before, with sunset dates. Why does sunset dates matter? If you increase taxes, even if it's intended only to be temporary, but there's no sunset date, it has an immediate impact on companies' financial statements because they have to presume that that tax increase is going into perpetuity. If you make the adjustment temporary and make it clear with the sunset date, not only does it apply the appropriate political inducement to revisit that increase when times improve, but it also provides some relief for business taxpayers from a financial statement impact. And then finally, and probably most controversially, I'm going to tell you what not to do. So Jocelyn, if you can advance to the last slide. Do not create a blue ribbon tax reform commission. Look, I love testifying before commissions. I've made my living off testifying before commissions. I'm not in any way against commissions. Just now is the wrong time. You don't have time for it. And as I discussed earlier, we don't have any lessons really to learn yet about the economic changes that are being wrought as we speak. The second thing is don't rely on tax expenditure reports. Nearly every state has a tax expenditure report, and nearly all of them are very, very bad. And I don't mean that because the people who prepare them don't know what they're doing. They do. It's generally because the direction they've received, whether it's through legislation or an executive branch action on how to put these reports together, doesn't make any distinction between a true tax expenditure and a deduction, a credit, or something else that's part of the ordinary tax basis. For example, the aforementioned net operating loss deduction, or in the sales tax, a sales for resale exemption. I wouldn't consider either one of those remotely close to a tax expenditure. They're part of the normal business income tax base. They're part of the normal sales tax base, but nearly every tax expenditure report will look at those. So I'm not saying you shouldn't look at these reports. I'm just saying you shouldn't rely on them without additional information. I'm not an incentives guy. I've never worked on tax incentives in my life. It's not been part of my practice either currently or when I was with the Council on State Taxation. But I still think that you need to be careful about looking at those lists of exemptions and exclusions and credits and drawing the conclusion, which I think is inappropriate, that all of them are kind of ripe for changing because they represent some perversion, if you will, of the tax system. Second to last, I don't suggest taxing business inputs. There is, I think, an inclination across the board to look at sales tax reform. I think that's an appropriate thing to do. But what's interesting when you look at sales tax-based reform and you hear every economist say that states should be taxing more consumption, people forget the second part of the sentence, which is, except that you shouldn't tax business inputs. I'm sure Fred or any of the other folks at COST would be dying to jump in and say, share some of the great data that they have on how much of the business input or how much of the sales tax base is already business inputs. Expanding the sales tax base to business inputs during an economic contraction is a bad thing to do. It's a bad thing to do anyway. I could probably talk on this for a full hour, but I'll save all of you and Linda would be happy to come back at another time. And then finally, don't go crazy. I mean, the reality is it's easy to go crazy when you're dealing with not only all of the things that are happening in the legislative world, but also in the personal world. There's still uncertainty about exactly how legislatures are going to meet and debate. I think that you all have lots of tools at your disposal. Rely on them, whether they're the folks at NCSL, to get comparative data on what other states are doing, the business community, like I talked about earlier, or any of the other trusted resources. There's a lot of ideas out there. Many of them focus on how to manage through this current crisis so that in the future, when times are better, we can talk about whether fundamental wholesale changes are necessary. I personally don't believe there's such thing as an ideal state tax system or an ideal tax base. I think it's a trade-off that is always going to need to be made, and it's going to vary, that trade-off from state to state. But even though I don't believe in one, I'm always happy to debate that too. So when we get to better times, we're talking about what the ideal tax system looks like. I welcome those conversations. And with that, Linda, I think I've left a couple of minutes if there are any questions.
Thank you, Joe.
And I see it's just a discussion about the beard. I can answer questions about that too.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, Joe. Again, a very good historical context that you provided for us here. As you mentioned, what we are enduring right now is something very unique, extremely unprecedented, and continues to throw uncertainty at us, which is the big item here. And actually, that is sort of a nice, I think, transition into our final uh, issue area that we're going to discuss here, our roundtable. And given all this uncertainty with respect to how long we expect this pandemic to last, and also given the uncertainty with whether or not Congress and the president are going to be able to enact any kind of COVID relief or additional COVID relief stimulus for states, definitely adds to the challenges that states are having to deal with right now with respect to trying to foresee and forecast and prioritize budgets going forward. So, and that really is the topic of our roundtable discussion here. What are the most pressing tax revenue issues facing your state in 2021? So we would love to have some contributions in this area. Would anybody like to offer up some of their own insight and experiences?
Erlinda, this is John. If you want me to chime in, we'll get stuff started. First of all, Joe,
Sounds great.
Joe, I think you're absolutely right, and Julie commented on it. Don't form a task force. I think that was pretty smart. And the problem with Joe, though, is he considers coffee a business input. So, you know, if it was up to Joe, he would excuse everything, like toilet paper is a business input to Joe. So you got to take Joe with a grain of salt. We're in Wisconsin, so again, I want to applaud the work of this committee. It was the whole first part of this conversation was talking about the sales tax issue, and being part of that when it at fairly, not as long as Joe has, but for the last 6 years, that has paid great dividends for us here in the state of Wisconsin. So we had the foresight of implementing that platform right away, but we wanted to make sure that the additional revenue was not an additional tax on our citizens. So we insisted that it be applied to the first two tax brackets, not the top two, the first two, so that it would help anybody under $40,000. And we just got that legislative fiscal memo out as those results start coming in as our year finishes up here. And that will bring down the first two brackets in the state of Wisconsin by nearly 12%, 50 basis points, from 4% down to 3.5%, saving that segment of people about $401 million in income tax. And of course, then that's offset by online sales tax. Now, I'd like to tell you, we could see that we were going to have an explosion in online purchases, but of course nobody could see that. But it was just some great work, and I think it just goes to show that good quality policy is always good quality policy. In this case, it was better than we expected. The state of Wisconsin had run about a $1.1 billion surplus in spite of a lot of the tax relief. We did a $500 million tax reduction package in the last biennium, and then of course I just mentioned the reduction offsetting the internet sales tax against income, which looks like it'll be another $400 million. And even then, we still were running about a $1.1 billion surplus. Of course, that's gone. We did save about upwards of $800 million into our rainy day fund, which is unheard of, about half of what I think it should be. I chair Ways and Means. And then we look like we will probably be looking at around a $2 billion biennium shortfall. So not fun. And we will be looking at some of those issues. The committee has done some great ideas. You know, do you raise revenue? Do you raise revenue in the midst of climbing back out of a hole? I think that's very hard. Fortunately, Wisconsin is heavy in manufacturing, and that sector has been good. We are either number one or number two in jobs in manufacturing, between us and Indiana, depending on the year. So we've got some resources, but it will be tough. And I think the other issue, and I'd be curious to know, maybe this could be another topic at some point in time, Erlinda. I'm old enough, I'm 62, I'm old enough to remember when in the early 80s, we broke up Ma Bell. And it went from Ma Bell to all of the little, what we call the baby bells that we have now today. And that was gut wrenching. That was gut wrenching for that industry. People lost jobs. The entire paradigm shifted, but it brought on this thing. I mean, you know, we wouldn't have had that. And you couple with that exactly at the same time in around 1980, we deregulated the trucking industry. Now, again, I know that's 40-year history, but I want you to understand the ramifications of that. Prior to what we have now, there was no such thing as it was much, the trucking industry was regulated very much like the airline industry is regulated now. It's awful. And so you had to buy a trainload of rear axles. Let's say if you're in the car manufacturing business, you had to buy a trainload of rear axles, and you had to buy weeks worth of supply because that's how long it took you to get it. And now we have what's called the just-in-time delivery system. So we can now use those two technologies. So anytime a paradigm shifts, everything goes back to zero. And we're able to sit in our living room, order all of our groceries, all of our stuff from this thing here, and have them drop shipped instantly at our front porch. That was not even possible in 1980 because the systems weren't in place. So my question is, what is that today? And so when we sit and look at it, we have 12 universities here in the state of Wisconsin. And I got to be honest with you, we gave the University of Eau Claire $250,000 last year for a new $250 million last year for a new building. And maybe all we need to do is buy them a new camera. So I say that tongue in cheek, but we absolutely, some of the issues we're going to have in spending is, what are we spending money on? And so that's going to be a very, very difficult discussion to have. I mean, again, I don't mean to pick on universities. They serve a great role, but again, we used to tongue in, you know, all the universities, particularly the University of Madison in Wisconsin. We used to look down our nose at the University of Phoenix. Oh, that's not a real university. They don't even have a building. Well, guess what? Now they're all the University of Phoenix, and they got worse tech support. So as a legislator that's got to allocate resources to that, those are some of the challenges that we're going to have. And say, we really need to zero base this conversation and say, do we need 12 campuses? And if you're all putting in a virtual system, do we need digital managers in every single one? Do we need studios in every single one? And so those are going to be some very, very difficult questions for us to ask as we look at both the revenue side and the spending side in the state of Wisconsin. I'm curious, Senator Ann Rest, you're in Minnesota, just next door to us. Are you on with us today? What thoughts do you have? What are you guys going to be doing or looking at? See if Ann is with us. If not, we can talk to my friend Carlucci. What's going on in New York?
Looks like Senator Neal would like to weigh in on Nevada.
Yes.
All right, let's go.
All right, thank you. So I think what's interesting what's going on in Nevada, everybody knows that we're tourism and gaming based. And so when COVID hit, tourism represented about $600 million in our budget that literally didn't come in. And so the conversation that we're having now is, number one, what is the new business model that's going to play out with gaming? So then we can decide what is an effective tax policy structure that makes sense for the new business model that's going to be revived. Number two, I see going forward that we may have some progressive versus business issues. There are some progressive groups that are pushing to increase our real estate transfer tax. And so what they call McMansions, right? Let's tax the big homes. And then also they want to try to tax capital gains because they feel like they want to go after investments. And so there's this movement that I feel is happening that is, I don't feel is connected to pragmatism in terms of, you cannot create tax policy on a temporary situation and then policy that will not manifest true change and an effective and sustainable revenue base, right? And so that's happening. And if you guys watched our special session, there is a single industry tax where they're going after mining. So there's 3 mining bills that will be in play in the 21 session. One has a dividend that they're seeking to return money back to citizens, which is about $50. And then the other is trying to look at somewhere around a 19% rate increase on mining and taking them out of the Constitution. And so that's going to be a very wild session. And then the next is the teachers are pushing to increase the gaming tax, which is 6.75, and bump it up to 12. And so let me just say, I don't know coming in as on the other side in the Senate, if I'm going to still be a revenue chair, but we're going to have a very interesting tax policy session with a few firecrackers. Let's just say that.
Thank you. Now, Senator-elect Neal, congratulations on your Senate race, and appreciate that that input there, that insight. Would anybody else like to contribute and offer up some insight and experiences of what you're dealing with in your state currently?
I have a question for you legislators out there, and I guess Joe as well. You know, looking at how states across the country are starting to shut down again. I know there's a lot of resistance to that in some areas, but are those decisions being factored into your planning for 2021? Is that interrupting your ability to, you know, really focus on set priorities and, you know, assuming, I think like the Moody's analysis Joe mentioned, you know, those build in assumptions that there will be more federal aid and that there will not be further shutdowns. If those do not come to pass, how are those going to alter your outlooks?
Jackson, I'll jump in. I mean, great questions, and that's a significant part of the uncertainty right now. I would make two observations, though, to contrast with what happened in the spring. First, from a government intervention perspective, we are far more nuanced now than some of those early shutdowns where, you know, it was just sort of shut everything down, stay home. So the interventions are more targeted and thus have less of a detrimental impact on the economy. And then second, not only individuals, but particularly businesses have learned how to manage with the pandemic. Now that's worked to a greater or lesser extent, depending on, you know, where you are, the type of industry you're in. But, you know, like for example, in my business, I think it was like a lot of businesses, you know, we went from one day encouraging people to not come in if they were ill, to be, you know, careful. And then literally 24 hours later said, office is shut, you can't come in. There's a lot more flexibility now. And so I think the business community is better able to deal with that. Supply chains have been replenished for the most part. There's still some dislocations there as well. So I think the increased caseload is undoubtedly going to have a negative impact on economic activity. Hopefully it won't be as deep or as lasting as it was earlier in the spring.
Yeah, and I think, Jackson, we are assuming things. I mean, I think the marketplace is doing exactly what you expect the marketplace to do. And so I think what we're seeing is you don't need to put limits on restaurants. The people are already doing that. You don't have to put a 50% limit on a restaurant. They're not 50% full anyway. So I think what Joe was saying is true. We're starting to see the economic reactions in the state of Wisconsin. So it's our assumption, and we just had a caucus conference call just before getting on this one. And our, you know, we have some things that we have to do to support, to continue to support the nursing home industry and the hospital industry, and we're absolutely willing and prepared to do that. But we're making the assumption that we're not going to go through some more shutdowns. I think Joe's right. I think it's become much more nuanced and targeted, and the marketplace has adjusted, and people have developed new habits. Now I'll have to tell you, I have not looked at the data. I mean, you know, what we're going to need to do, and to Joe's point again, and I think one of the other guys too, is we're going to have to wait till we get a little bit more data to look at all the various revenue streams. I mean, it's not just sales tax, it's use tax, it's excise tax, it's it's corporate revenue, it's income tax. I mean, we got to take a look at all of those issues and keep in mind, most of us pushed off our revenue numbers. I mean, I don't think we had to file. I don't think I filed my taxes until like 4 weeks ago. And so, you know, the ramifications of all of that have yet to be felt yet. So, I mean, we're trying to make decisions, I think, with insufficient data, but you asked, do we see that continuing to happen? I don't think so in Wisconsin, but we'll see.
Thank you. Well, if we don't have any more comments, I would like to first pitch a webinar that our fiscal program is hosting in 2 days. I'll put that in the chat box, but there are a couple familiar faces to the task force, Harley Duncan with KPMG and David Brunori with George Washington University, who will be speculating about potential state tax actions in 2021 and providing their opinions on, you know, what they would be wise to consider moving forward. And that will be this Thursday at 2 p.m. So a good way to build on this conversation here today.
And I would like to suggest, I mentioned to Erlinda on the phone yesterday, but, you know, apparently Florida, there is no COVID because they're completely open. So I'm going to propose that we go there because I need to be at a beach. You know, I've not done any traveling this year and I'm starting to get crazy. So I'm all in, Erlinda, just tell me and I'll be there.
Well, thank you. I think we are all waiting until we can travel somewhere together and gather somewhat safely. But, you know, I appreciate everyone's participation today. You know, and of course, all of our sponsors. We definitely are grateful for your continued support, especially during this crazy, crazy time. We know that eventually we'll hit some sort of normality where we can get together in person, but in the meantime, we continue to try to bring programming to you in a virtual format that is still useful, practical, and applicable to hopefully what you're doing at the States. Right now, we don't have a plan to meet in person for forum, of course, which we normally have in December. So that's, you know, pretty, I guess, expected at this point. a beach and a bartender. Okay, that sounds great. I love that idea. I think that's all we need right now too. But we will stay tuned and stay focused. And as you know, getting into the next year, we will be again trying to upgrade and relaunch a lot of the things that we tried to do this year. So please do stay tuned, and we do appreciate your support going forward, and hope to continue to see you here as we move forward. So thank you very much, everybody. And again, as Jackson mentioned, please do stay tuned for our other related meeting on Thursday, or webinar, I should say. Thank you so much, and we will post all the presentations from today on our website.
Thanks, team.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.